The observation continued in silence, but silence on a Union vessel was never truly empty. It was filled with calculations, reassessments, and the quiet rewriting of assumptions that had once been considered universal truths. Sol 3 remained stable in the holographic projection, turning slowly as if unaware it was being judged by minds that had mapped hundreds of civilizations and erased just as many from historical memory. Commander Vyrek stood with his arms folded, watching data streams update in real time. Human population density, energy consumption, environmental impact, communication patterns. Everything was too organized for a death world and too chaotic for a standard habitable world. It refused classification in a way that made analysts increasingly uneasy. A junior technician reported that humans were actively modifying their environment on a planetary scale, redirecting rivers, flattening mountains, reshaping coastlines, and altering atmospheric composition. Vyrek asked if this was accidental damage from industrial expansion, but the technician replied that much of it was intentional engineering. That answer shifted the room's mood again. A Class 9 world that reshapes itself is dangerous enough, but a species that reshapes it on purpose suggests something far worse: confidence. On Earth, humans continued their lives completely unaware of the growing dossier being compiled about them. In one region, construction workers argued loudly over lunch while building structures that would later be classified as megacities. In another, students prepared for exams with the kind of stress response that union medics labeled as self-imposed psychological endurance training. In a third, a group of friends debated for nearly an hour about which fast food restaurant was superior, as if the outcome had any measurable impact on survival. To the Union, none of it made sense. Everything looked like distraction layered on top of a civilization that should have been in constant crisis. But crisis, when it appeared, revealed something else entirely. A seismic event was detected near a densely populated human region. A structural collapse followed. On the Union feed, analysts expected confusion, panic, and disorganized retreat. Instead, within minutes, coordinated human response units arrived with precision that contradicted everything else they had observed. No hesitation. No visible leadership confusion. Individuals acted independently yet aligned perfectly, as if the species had an unspoken protocol for disaster embedded in its behavior. People were pulled from rubble. Fires were contained. Medical assistance was deployed. Communication remained surprisingly stable. Then, just as quickly as it had escalated, the situation stabilized and humans returned to rebuilding as if nothing had permanently broken. Vyrek watched the footage twice before speaking. He asked how long it took for their systems to recover. The analyst replied that recovery was not the correct term. Humans did not return to a previous state. They transitioned into a new one and continued forward without pause. That distinction unsettled the room more than expected. Most civilizations define disasters as disruptions. Humans appeared to treat them as transitions. Then came the first real philosophical disturbance in the data. Humans were observed engaging in voluntary hardship. They exercised in controlled environments, deliberately exhausting themselves. They climbed structures for no reason other than physical challenge. They participated in competitive games that simulated conflict without lethal consequence. They even consumed media that induced fear, sadness, and stress while fully aware it was artificial. One analyst described it as emotional self-experimentation. Another suggested it was training behavior. But Vyrek noticed something deeper. There was no external force requiring any of it. The species was choosing difficulty as a form of experience. A report was played showing humans watching a competitive sport in massive numbers, reacting emotionally to outcomes that had no impact on survival, resources, or planetary stability. The intensity of reaction rivaled military engagements recorded in other civilizations. Vyrek asked why such systems existed. The answer was unclear. Humans called it entertainment. That word did not translate well into Union logic. Entertainment implied survival efficiency waste without consequence. Yet humans invested enormous emotional energy into it willingly. Then came another anomaly. A fragment of intercepted communication revealed humans discussing the possibility of extraterrestrial observation. The conversation was casual, almost joking. One human suggested that if aliens were watching, they should think humans were cool. Another responded that humanity was currently arguing over food toppings and would not pass any interstellar evaluation. Laughter followed. The transmission ended. The bridge went quiet again. Virek replayed it once more, slower this time. He focused not on the words but on the tone. There was no fear, no attempt at concealment, no instinctive suppression of self-image. Instead, there was acceptance of imperfection paired with humor about it. That combination did not align with any known survival psychology model. One analyst finally spoke carefully, suggesting that perhaps humans did not believe they were under observation. Virek agreed, but added that belief was not the only possibility. It was also possible they did not care. That possibility changed the atmosphere entirely, because indifference toward unknown observers was not typical of fragile civilizations. It was either extreme ignorance or extreme confidence. Both outcomes were dangerous in different ways. As the Union continued its silent watch, Earth rotated beneath them in calm ignorance. Cities glowed. Oceans moved. Storms formed and dissolved. Life continued as it always had. And somewhere in that ordinary chaos, humanity remained exactly what it had always been. A species that treated survival as normal, danger as background noise, and the unknown as something to joke about rather than fear. And for the first time in recorded Union observation history, Commander Virek issued a quiet directive that had never been written in any protocol manual before. Increase monitoring resolution. No one asked why. They already knew. The order to increase monitoring resolution was not questioned, but it changed the mood aboard the Cardin in a subtle way that every crew member felt but nobody openly acknowledged. Higher resolution meant closer attention, and closer attention meant the Union was no longer treating Sol 3 as just another distant curiosity. It meant concern was starting to form, even if it had not yet been named. Earth expanded in the holographic display until entire continents filled the observation chamber wall. Data streams intensified, showing not just cities and populations but micro-patterns of behavior, traffic flows, communication spikes, economic activity, and biological stress indicators. Humans were no longer just a species on a death world. They were a synchronized chaos pattern operating at planetary scale. A technician reported something unusual in the data. Human sleep cycles were not uniform, yet the planet never stopped functioning. Some regions were awake while others rested, and yet global systems remained stable. Virek asked if this indicated centralized coordination. The answer was no. There was no single governing mind, no planetary command structure. It was distributed intelligence without a central controller, and somehow it worked. That concept alone made several analysts uneasy because most Union civilizations required hierarchical control to maintain stability. Humans did not. On Earth, life continued in its usual contradiction of seriousness and absurdity. In one city, office workers argued intensely over deadlines that seemed critical to them but meaningless to the universe. In another, a group of teenagers filmed themselves attempting increasingly ridiculous challenges for social approval. In yet another, engineers designed systems that would later be used in disaster response, space exploration, and infrastructure development, all while complaining about coffee quality as if it were a matter of existential importance. To the Union observers, it looked like a civilization constantly oscillating between profound capability and trivial distraction. Then a new dataset appeared: human conflict simulations. At first, analysts assumed it was military training, but deeper analysis revealed something more unsettling. Humans created structured environments where they voluntarily imposed rules of conflict that did not reflect real survival conditions. Competitive strategy games, tactical simulations, and large-scale cooperative challenges existed across cultures. Millions of individuals participated in systems that rewarded coordination, planning, and prediction, all without any direct survival necessity. One analyst described it as a species practicing complexity for its own sake. Virex studied one particular simulation feed carefully. Large groups of humans were coordinating in real time to achieve abstract objectives under pressure, adapting instantly to changing conditions, and communicating with remarkable efficiency. He asked if this behavior translated into real-world competence. The analyst confirmed that in many cases it did. Skills developed in these systems often carried over into engineering, logistics, and emergency response. That answer created a contradiction that the Union struggled to reconcile. A species that treated non-lethal conflict as entertainment was simultaneously improving its real-world survival capability through it. Then came a more uncomfortable observation. Humans did not remain serious even in high-stress environments. During disaster response events, individuals were observed making jokes, not as avoidance but as a parallel layer of communication. One analyst initially labeled it as psychological instability, but later revised the assessment. It was not instability. It was regulation. Humor appeared to function as a stabilizing mechanism that prevented emotional overload while maintaining operational effectiveness. Virex did not immediately comment on this finding, but he reviewed it twice. Another transmission intercept added further complexity. Humans were observed discussing existential topics casually during ordinary daily activity. Questions about purpose, existence, and meaning were often embedded in jokes or informal conversation. There was no uniform philosophical framework, yet the species frequently touched upon concepts that other civilizations required formal institutions to handle. The difference was that humans did it while eating, walking, or waiting in queues, as if existential uncertainty was just another background process in their cognition. Then came the incident that shifted Union classification anxiety into something closer to concern. A long-range passive sensor detected an unintentional deep space signal leak originating from Earth. It was not directed communication. It was spillover from their technological infrastructure. Within that noise, analysts extracted a fragmented conversation between two humans discussing the possibility of alien observers. One of them joked that if aliens were watching, humanity would already be judged for arguing over trivial matters like food preferences and entertainment. The other responded that any advanced species would probably assume humans were a chaotic but harmless civilization. Laughter followed again. Virex replayed the segment several times in silence. Then he asked the question that no one wanted to answer directly. If a species is aware of the concept of external observation and still reacts with humor rather than fear, what does that imply about its perception of threat? No analyst responded immediately. Eventually one offered a cautious interpretation. It could mean they did not believe any observer was capable of harming them. Another possibility was that they believed harm was inevitable and therefore chose not to emotionally invest in fear responses. Both interpretations were equally concerning. Virex leaned back slightly and stared at the rotating projection of Earth. Or, he said quietly, they simply do not treat unknown intelligence as superior. That statement changed the atmosphere in the room again. Because in Union history, every known civilization that had dismissed unknown intelligence as non-threatening had either been destroyed by it or had become it. Earth continued spinning in silence beneath them, unaware that it was now being studied not as a curiosity, but as a potential contradiction to everything the Galactic Union believed about survival, intelligence, and fear. And for the first time since contact, Commander Virex stopped thinking of humans as something to observe and started wondering what it would mean if they ever looked back with intent. The thought that humans might eventually look back with intent did not trigger alarm protocols in the Union systems, but it did something more subtle. It tightened the discipline of every analyst on the Cardon. Observation was no longer passive. It had become careful. Every scan of Earth was now double-checked, every interpretation cross-referenced, as if the planet itself might one day audit the observers. Sol 3 remained unchanged in appearance. Continents rotated under sunlight, clouds formed and dissolved, and cities pulsed with activity. But the meaning of that activity had become harder to define. Humans were no longer being evaluated as a simple survival species. They were being evaluated as an unknown system that behaved like both a survival machine and a cultural experiment at the same time. A new report arrived from orbital sensors tracking long-term atmospheric emissions. Analysts noted that humans were altering their planet's atmosphere in measurable ways while simultaneously developing technologies to mitigate those same changes. Virek reviewed the data and asked if this was contradiction or adaptation. The analyst hesitated before answering that it was both. Humans created problems and solutions in parallel, often without centralized coordination between the two processes. That explanation did not satisfy anyone in the room, but it was the only one that matched the data. On Earth, this contradiction was simply called progress. In one region, engineers constructed massive energy systems designed to power entire cities. In another, activists protested the environmental impact of those systems. In a third, researchers developed counter-technologies to reduce that impact. All three groups believed they were improving the world. From the Union perspective, it looked like a civilization arguing with itself while still moving forward. Then came another anomaly in behavioral data. Humans were observed deliberately placing themselves into stressful situations and then sharing the experience publicly. They recorded failures, mistakes, and embarrassing moments, and others consumed these recordings voluntarily. Analysts initially classified this as social instability, but deeper review suggested something more structured. Humans were normalizing imperfection. Instead of hiding failure, they were distributing it. Virek asked what purpose this served. The analyst suggested it reduced social pressure and increased group cohesion by making individual failure less isolating. In simpler terms, humans used shared embarrassment as a bonding mechanism. Virek paused for a moment before asking if any other known species used similar systems. The answer was no. On Earth, a group of humans uploaded a video of one of their members attempting and failing a simple physical challenge, followed by laughter from all participants, including the subject. The Union observers flagged the emotional response pattern as voluntary vulnerability expression. One junior analyst quietly remarked that the species appeared to treat dignity as optional. Meanwhile, deeper scans revealed something even more concerning. Human children were being exposed to structured learning systems that gradually increased in complexity under conditions of stress, reward, and evaluation. Yet instead of rejecting this system, young humans adapted to it over time. They learned to function under pressure, recover from failure, and continue improving despite repeated setbacks. Virek studied the developmental models and noted something unusual. The species was effectively training its entire population in resilience from an early stage of life. A technician suggested that this might explain their survival on a Class 9 world. It was not just environmental adaptation. It was cultural reinforcement of endurance. Then came a shift in observational tone when a new set of communications was intercepted. Humans discussing fear. But not fear of external threats. Fear of internal failure, social judgment, and personal inadequacy. One conversation involved a human joking about being more afraid of public speaking than of hypothetical alien invasion. Another joked that aliens could invade Earth, and humans would still worry about how they looked while being abducted. Laughter followed again. Virek studied the translation for a long time before speaking. They normalize fear, he said. An analyst responded carefully that humans did not eliminate fear responses but integrated them into daily functioning. Fear did not stop them. It accompanied them like background noise. That concept was difficult for Union psychology models. Most civilizations attempted to suppress fear, eliminate it, or organize society to avoid triggering it. Humans appeared to operate while carrying it constantly. Then the first true moment of unease arrived. A deep space passive array picked up structured radio leakage that did not originate from intentional broadcasting. It was incidental emissions from human technology expanding outward. Within that noise, analysts detected a pattern of repeated references to extraterrestrial life. Not in scientific context, but in casual cultural discussion. Humans were not only imagining alien existence. They were joking about it, debating it, and in some cases casually accepting it as plausible. One fragment stood out. A human voice suggested that any alien species observing Earth would likely assume humanity was chaotic but ultimately harmless. Another responded that any advanced species would probably avoid contact entirely due to confusion rather than fear. The exchange ended with laughter again. Virek replayed it multiple times. Then he asked a question that did not have an easy answer. If they believe we exist, why are they not afraid? No one answered immediately. Eventually, a senior analyst spoke quietly. Sir, they may not define unknown intelligence as automatically hostile. That sentence settled in the room like a weight, because in Union history, that assumption had been the foundation of survival for most civilizations. Unknown meant danger. Unknown meant preparation. Unknown meant fear. Humans treated unknown as speculation, humor, or curiosity. And that difference was becoming harder to ignore. Earth continued its rotation beneath them, indifferent to observation, still engaged in its endless cycle of work, conflict, cooperation, failure, and laughter. A civilization that did not pause for fear of being watched because it had never learned that being watched should matter. And somewhere deep in the Union command vessel, Commander Virek began to realize something unsettling. They were not just observing a Deathworld species anymore. They were observing a species that might not recognize the rules of being observed at all. The realization that humanity might not even recognize the rules of being observed changed the tone aboard the Cardin in a way no one could fully describe. It was not panic, not yet, but it removed the comfortable distance that observers usually relied on. Earth was no longer just a subject of study. It felt, increasingly, like something participating in the same reality on different terms. Commander Virek ordered a recalibration of all behavioral models. The assumption that fear of external intelligence was universal had now become questionable. If humans did not instinctively categorize unknown observers as threats, then every predictive model built by the Union for first contact scenarios needed revision. That alone was disturbing enough to silence the bridge for a long stretch of time. On the holographic display, Earth continued its ordinary chaos. Weather systems moved across continents. Night and day shifted like a breathing rhythm. Cities glowed in clusters of activity that never fully stopped. But now every detail was being reinterpreted through a new lens. Not what are they doing, but why does this not collapse them? A technician reported another anomaly. Human infrastructure systems were highly interdependent yet decentralized. Power grids, communication networks, transportation systems, all functioned through distributed control rather than centralized command. Yet despite frequent localized failures, the overall system rarely collapsed. Instead, it adapted and rerouted. Virek asked if this level of redundancy was intentional. The analyst replied that humans appeared to design systems expecting failure as a normal condition rather than an exception. That idea lingered. A civilization that expects failure does not fear it the same way. On Earth, humans continued their daily contradictions. In one region, workers repaired infrastructure damaged by natural disaster while simultaneously complaining about overtime compensation. In another, students memorized complex material under pressure, then immediately joked about forgetting it. In yet another, emergency responders trained repeatedly for catastrophic scenarios they hoped would never occur. To Union observers, it looked like a species permanently rehearsing collapse without ever fully experiencing it. Then came a new behavioral layer that further complicated classification. Humans actively sought novelty in discomfort. They engaged in recreational activities involving physical exhaustion, emotional intensity, and controlled risk. Some climbed dangerous terrain for enjoyment. Some subjected themselves to simulated fear environments. Others deliberately tested psychological limits through competitive or immersive experiences. Virek asked why a species already living in a dangerous environment would seek additional artificial stress. The analyst suggested that it might be a method of maintaining adaptability. If a species stops encountering stress entirely, it may lose responsiveness when real danger arrives. Virek considered this carefully. So they train themselves, he said slowly, for unpredictability. Yes, sir. And they do this for enjoyment. Yes, sir. A pause followed. That is either extremely efficient, Virek concluded, or extremely unstable. No one contradicted him. Then came another fragment of intercepted communication that shifted attention again. Humans were discussing the idea of alien contact more openly now in cultural spaces. Not as fear, but as speculation mixed with humor and curiosity. One human suggested that if aliens were watching, they were probably confused. Another suggested that aliens would likely assume humanity was a species that had already won its planet and was now just vibing. Laughter followed the statement. The translation of that phrase caused confusion among analysts. Vibing, one repeated. Clarify meaning. Context suggests relaxed existence without immediate survival pressure focus, another answered. Virek did not respond immediately. He simply watched the data stream. A species that had won its planet should, in theory, have entered a stable post-conflict phase. Yet Earth did not behave like a civilization that had completed survival. It behaved like one that never stopped treating existence as ongoing improvisation. Then came the more serious development. A deep space sensor detected structured signal leakage again, stronger than before. It was not directed communication, but incidental emissions increasing as human technology expanded. Within it, analysts identified repeated references to extraterrestrial intelligence in multiple cultural contexts: scientific, fictional, philosophical, and casual. Humanity was not only aware of the concept of alien life, it had integrated it into its imagination extensively without consensus or fear. One segment stood out in particular. A human voice suggested that if aliens were observing Earth, they would likely assume humans were chaotic but fundamentally survivable. Another voice responded that aliens might avoid contact simply because humans were too unpredictable to categorize properly. The exchange ended with laughter once again. Virek replayed the recording in silence. Then he spoke. They do not fear misclassification. An analyst replied cautiously, "Sir? If they believe observers exist," Virek continued, "they are not adjusting behavior to be understood. They are simply continuing as they are." That was the key difference. Most civilizations, when they believed they were being observed, altered themselves. They performed. They hid. They projected strength or innocence. Humanity did neither consistently. Sometimes they ignored the concept entirely. Sometimes they joked about it. Sometimes they acknowledged it and moved on. It was not consistency that defined them. It was indifference to consistency. On Earth, nothing changed in response to the Union's scrutiny because Earth did not know scrutiny had become focused. Even if it did, it was unclear whether that knowledge would matter. And that uncertainty was beginning to affect the observers more than the observed. Commander Virek finally issued a new directive. Prepare contingency protocols for non-fear-based civilizations. No one had written those protocols before. So the room remained quiet, and Earth kept rotating beneath them, unaware that the galaxy was slowly realizing something deeply uncomfortable. Not that humanity was dangerous, but that humanity might not interpret danger the same way at all. The new directive, prepare contingency protocols for non-fear-based civilizations, remained on the command display longer than any order normally should. No one removed it. No one challenged it. It simply stayed there like an unresolved equation that refused to simplify. Because the problem was no longer what humans were. It was what humans didn't do. They didn't consistently react the way every known intelligent species reacted when observed. They didn't stabilize into predictable behavioral patterns under scrutiny. They didn't display universal fear responses, nor universal curiosity, nor universal hostility. Instead, they fluctuated between seriousness and comedy, between chaos and coordination, between indifference and extreme precision. And that fluctuation was becoming the most dangerous thing in the Union database. On the holographic display, Earth rotated calmly. But now every layer of data was being examined at maximum resolution. Analysts tracked communication networks not just for content, but for intent structures. What they found was unsettling in its simplicity. Humans did not always act with a single collective intention. Millions of intentions coexisted simultaneously, often contradicting each other, yet still producing coherent planetary function. One analyst finally voiced what others were thinking but avoiding. They are not a unified system. Another responded immediately, but they behave like one when it matters. That contradiction hung in the air. Because both statements were true. On Earth, a crisis event occurred again, this time a large-scale infrastructure failure caused by environmental instability. The Union expected panic cascades. Instead, humans responded with rapid coordination across unrelated groups. Engineers, civilians, emergency teams, and even ordinary individuals who had no official role all contributed in different ways. Within hours, stability was restored in multiple regions. But what stood out most was not efficiency. It was attitude. Humans joked during recovery. They comforted each other using humor. They criticized systems while rebuilding them. They expressed exhaustion and frustration and then continued anyway. To Union observers, it looked like a civilization emotionally refusing to shut down. Virek watched the recovery footage without speaking for a long time. Then he asked a question that had no technical framing. Why do they continue functioning emotionally during collapse scenarios? No analyst answered quickly enough. Finally one said, "Sir, they may not categorize collapse as final." That sentence changed everything. Because in Union civilizations, collapse meant end-state transitions. Systems failed, societies fractured, and recovery required reconstruction from reduced baselines. But humans treated collapse as interruption, not termination. Temporary state change, not conclusion. That distinction made prediction models significantly less reliable. Then came the final and most important intercepted transmission. A routine human communication stream, unintentional leakage through expanding deep space infrastructure. Among thousands of fragments, analysts isolated a recurring pattern, references to humanity itself, framed in humor, irony, and self-awareness. One fragment stood out. A human voice said, "If aliens are watching us, I hope they're not grading us, because we're definitely improvising." Another responded, "We'd fail the inspection on purpose anyway." Laughter followed. But then something unusual happened. A third voice added, "Honestly, if they are watching, I hope they're nice." The tone changed slightly after that. Not fear. Not certainty. Just curiosity mixed with quiet hope. Virek replayed that segment only once. Then he leaned back and finally spoke in a low voice. "They are not behaving like a civilization that expects judgment." A senior analyst replied carefully, "Sir, what are they behaving like?" Virek hesitated. That hesitation itself was new. Then he said, "Like a species that assumes the universe is not evaluating them." Silence followed. Because that idea was more unsettling than hostility. Hostile civilizations could be managed. Fearful civilizations could be predicted. But a civilization that did not instinctively assume cosmic evaluation, that treated existence as ongoing experience rather than test or trial, that was something the Union had never prepared for. Earth remained unchanged below them. Still chaotic. Still humorous. Still dangerous in ways that were not fully understood. And for the first time since contact, Commander Virek did not issue an order. He simply watched. Because somewhere between all the contradictions, one conclusion had begun forming in the silence. Humans were not failing the expectations of the galaxy. They were ignoring the idea that expectations applied to them at all. And that, more than anything else, meant the Union had made its first real mistake. They had assumed Earth would react to being seen. But Earth was still acting like it had always been alone. And that realization did not arrive with alarms, or explosions, or any dramatic signal the Union had ever trained for. It arrived quietly, like a correction in an equation that suddenly made everything else wrong. On the Cardin, Commander Virek remained standing before the holographic Earth, but for the first time since the observation began, he was no longer interpreting data as a superior watching an inferior system. He was watching a system that refused the entire framework of superiority. Behind him, analysts waited for the next order. It did not come. Instead, Virek spoke in a tone that was almost calm. "Withdraw active interpretation models." A technician blinked. "Sir?" "We are not ready," Vyrek said simply. No one asked what they were not ready for, because the answer felt obvious now. Not invasion. Not war. Not first contact. Understanding. Because every model the Union had built assumed fear as a universal constant, assumed observation would trigger adaptation, assumed intelligence would bend toward predictability when watched closely enough. But Earth had not done any of that. It had continued. Argued. Built. Broken. Rebuilt. And treated all of it as normal. On the display, a final intercepted human broadcast played in low priority, just background noise among millions of signals. A human voice said, almost casually, "If aliens are out there, I hope they're not too serious. That would be awkward." A second voice laughed and replied, "Yeah, imagine them analyzing everything we do." Then a pause. Then the first voice added, "We'd probably still forget to fix the vending machine." Laughter followed. The transmission ended. On the bridge, no one laughed this time. Not because it wasn't funny, but because it no longer felt like a joke meant for them. It felt like something far more uncomfortable. A reminder that humanity had never been performing. They had simply been living. Commander Vyrek finally turned away from the hologram. "Mark Sol, 3 observation status," he said quietly. The pause. Unknown. Not hostile. Not friendly. Not classified. Just unknown in the most complete sense the Union had ever recorded. As the Carden slowly adjusted its orbit and reduced its sensor footprint, Earth remained unchanged beneath them, spinning through space, unaware that it had just been watched, analyzed, misread, reanalyzed, and ultimately left alone not because it was understood, but because it wasn't. And as the distance grew, one final thought lingered in Vyrek's mind. Unspoken, unrecorded, and dangerously simple. If they ever decide we matter, we will not be the ones observing anymore. And for the first time in Union history, retreat did not feel like defeat. It felt like survival.